So we might go to the first slide, Alex. Next slide. So when we're going about restoration, we're not just putting trees in the ground, we're aiming to really create self-sustaining, long-term, diverse ecosystems with all the complexity that they naturally have when we see them in a good condition. Can you hear me okay? Yep.
Yes.
So that includes a whole host of complexities like species diversity, fauna habitat diversity and structural diversity, genetic diversity when we have healthy big populations, and all the complex interdependent relationships that occur between those organisms and ecological processes. And all of you would know that living in a healthy ecosystem is not just about living in one particular kind of ecosystem, but we live in a mosaic of different systems, from wetlands to salt marshes to grassy woodlands and rainforests and wet and dry sclerophyll forests. So the diversity in our landscape is really what makes Australia and our environments support so much diversity, both for flora and fauna. So when we're restoring ecosystems, we really want to be thinking about what part of the landscapes and what ecosystems we're working with. Thanks, Alex. Next slide. I'm going to talk through several ways today of how we can enhance complexity in restoration, because there are lots of ways we can go about this, and hopefully we can maximize all of them. Firstly, working with natural resilience and regeneration potential in the landscape is a really key way of working with the natural processes and boosting our own efforts by working with what naturally happens in the landscape with succession and so on. Working outward from existing vegetation is one of the ways we can do that. Maximizing connectivity between remnant patches of vegetation and patch size is really important. Working with and building diversity in species selection and all the structural layers that comprise our ecosystems, and also doing what we can to enhance those relationships with fauna, because bringing fauna back into the landscape as early as we can also helps the plants in terms of seed dispersal and pollination services. And it's a two-way relationship, so building those relationships as soon as we can is really important. Next slide. Thanks, Alex. So one of the first steps is really trying to understand your site and where that occurs in the landscape. So what kind of target ecosystem you are trying to restore. As I mentioned, we have a whole host of different plant communities and ecosystems in our landscape. And so what you will be restoring will vary between where you are on the landscape, whether you're in a gully or on a north-facing slope, a south-facing slope, a ridgeline or a wetland, or between sandstone soils or volcanic soils, or and plant communities are really driven by some really key variables like that topographic position, soil type, exposure, and environmental and climatic variables. So looking around the landscape around you and understanding those landscape changes is a really key way of understanding the plant communities that you're working with. And there's lots of resources around too to help you understand that too. In addition to just observing what's going on in your own landscape, you can use local information like soils near me, understanding your soil landscapes, talking to local land care groups, local botanic gardens, looking at local ecological surveys and so on. So all plant communities have a combination of different growth forms, from trees to grasses, shrubs, ferns, sedges, and vines and climbers. And so really understanding what growth forms are present in your ecosystem is super helpful. And different ecosystems will have diversity in different parts of the community. So grassy ecosystems will have a lot of their diversity in the ground layers and in those herbaceous layers on the ground, whereas a subtropical rainforest will have a lot of that diversity in the canopy. So really tuning into how they're different is really helpful. Thanks, Alex. So if you don't have access to local studies or vegetation mapping or flora surveys, or another tool that's really easy for everyone to access now is Trees Near Me. This is a new app or website that's available that people might not be very familiar with. What it is it's more than just trees. It's actually giving you access to plant communities that occur in your area. So you can access this on the internet and download it on your phone or your iPad as well for being in the field. And you can zoom around a map and locate your site, and you will be given a whole suite of plant community types that occur in that area. And it will describe where they occur, what they look like, but also give you a species list for both the canopy and tree layers, but also the shrub and understory layers. So that's a really helpful resource in the absence of any more detailed information that you may or may not have. And if you're in a really highly cleared landscape too, you will notice there on the top of that screen, there's a pre-clearing option. So you can even get guidance on suggested types that might have been there before clearing. So that can be a good one to look at too. Thanks, Alex. Yeah, we can go back to that next slide. So restoration doesn't always need to involve planting. Our natural environment often has more resilience than we might expect. And it's often hidden in soil seed banks or in canopy stored seed banks or even in plant tissue in themselves, depending on their adaptation to disturbance events. So good bush will usually have enough resilience to bounce back from disturbance events like fire on its own without much intervention. So a lot of us would have seen the response of our bushland to recent fires where it might have looked completely barren for the first 6 or so months and take time to reestablish that cover. But within time, that recruitment really comes back on its own and it might just need a little bit of monitoring and managing any threats like from weed pressure or pest animals that might be moving into an open landscape. But it really doesn't need much more than that usually. But then there's an in-between stage where you might have landscapes that have patchy tree cover and patchy understory, where there's some resilience, but maybe needs a little bit of help, where you might do a combination of working with natural recruitment, but also bringing in extra seed and plantings. And then at the other extreme, where we have really low resilience ecosystems, where we might be working in agricultural, really heavily cleared landscapes on the right there, where there might still be a few ground covers around, but the seed bank might be quite depleted, and we really need to take a lot more effort and cost to bring that diversity back in through planting and other means. Thanks, Alex. So working with natural regeneration potential and one of the things that happens when landscapes are cleared is that when patches of bushland become isolated or they become isolated as small patches, a lot of the ecological functions really break down. So, and they cater for less and less species. So what happens is we end up losing species diversity, not only in fauna, but in flora as well, because as populations become smaller, the genetic pool becomes smaller and the pollination ability to cross and have healthy populations becomes more challenging. So really putting our efforts into restoring connections between patches and building patch size is really critical way of boosting and catering for more diversity for both flora and fauna in the landscape. And that having that diversity is really key part of making our landscapes resilient to extreme weather events like fire, and having the refuges and movement corridors that are really important for those populations to cope in those times. Thanks, Alex. So in really more highly degraded or cleared landscapes, you'll be familiar with seeing patches of vegetation amongst clearing and the odd paddock tree. And these paddock trees can be really important beacons of seed banks. Looking after those really, really mature trees in the landscape is really critical seed resource, as well as they're often a really great place to kickstart a recruitment, natural recruitment, and working with natural processes, even when there's not much else, what might not look like much else on the ground. If you can remove grazing pressure through fencing around them, you often will get natural colonization from the seed canopy of that tree itself, but also through birds moving into and using those trees as perches and bringing in seed from adjoining bushland. So protecting and working outward from those paddock trees also provides, an opportunity to build stepping stones between larger patches of bush. So that's a really great way to start to in a really heavily modified landscape. Thanks, Alex. So if you are planting, it's really good to think about all the different layers in your target ecosystem or plant community when you're selecting your plants. We often go straight to the trees and shrubs, which is okay, but which is, they're really important parts of getting the structure and the architecture, I guess, of the plant community up and established. But those ground layer species and grasses and forbs and ferns and sedges and so on are also really important in providing cover for fauna, and also just bringing in the diversity, because often a lot of the diversity is also in those ground layer growth forms. Also thinking about what growth forms you have and making sure you're not just putting trees and grasses, but also, ferns, grasses and sedges and the various forms that occur within your target ecosystem. And if you're doing a restoration for particular threatened fauna or particular species that are important in your region, have a think about what habitat resources they use and what food resources they rely on, and make sure you can try and cater for those in your plantings as well. Thanks, Alex. Yeah, so often it can be hard to access planting or plant stock for the diversity that we have in our natural ecosystems. Nurseries often need substantial lead times to cater for the diversity that occurs in our natural ecosystem. So having a look around in your property, you will often find there's a lot of seed resources around you. So just be super observant about what's in seed or fruit, from grasses to sedges to fleshy fruited rainforest trees to, daisies with seed or wattles with seed. All of those things you can use, and you don't. Obviously, if you're working with threatened species or threatened plant communities, you will need to be careful about getting a license to do that. But for other non-threatened or non-protected plants or species, you can do that within your property. So have a think about those resources at hand, use them, learn about them, learn what might break. Some might have germination or dormancy cues that they might need seed treatment, for example. Some of the peas, a lot of the peas have hard seed coats, so they might need to be treated with hot water or scarification. But there's so much information online about that these days. So yeah, get familiar with what's on your land and use it to your advantage. Thanks, Alex. Working with natural succession is a really great way to kickstart a regeneration process, especially where you have existing native vegetation adjoining a cleared area. If you can remove grazing pressure by fencing off a buffer zone around that existing native vegetation, you will generally get pioneer species trying to naturally moving into that area. This photo is showing mostly maples, wattle and black wattle moving in to an area that was once a paddock. And what that does is that wattles, it's not only wattle is a common thing we see, but it's also a range of species like Pomaderus or Coccinea or Goodenias. There's kangaroo apples. There's a range of species that do this, but wattles are really common. And they have a really important role in fixing and restoring nitrogen in the soil and providing a little bit of shelter to thin out those exotic grasses and allow for supporting the next round of recruitment of longer living plants and a greater diversity of plants. So, don't be frightened of them. Use them because they're really saving a heap of effort and labor in planting and cost in buying trees. So work with it, and you can even use it in stages. So let that stage mature, and then you'll find you'll get more understory coming in over time, and then you can progress outwards in an outward fashion, like in a stepwise fashion, and that can save you a lot of time and money. Thanks, Alex. So logs, litter and dead trees, these are things that are often missing in a really highly modified landscape, but they're really important to bring, really important resources that if you can add them to your landscape or just move them from one area to another into your restoration area, they can really help kickstart regeneration, because they play a few roles. They will really help enhance the return of fauna through bringing in insect activity, foraging resources, and sheltering resources for fauna. They also provide habitat for all the non-vascular plants like mosses, fungi, and lichen, which are super important for soil health and nutrient cycling. They also provide microhabitats for recruitment from the seed bank by providing little pockets of shelter and soil moisture. So, use what you have on your site and don't feel the need to clean up, because they're really useful in helping and supporting natural recruitment and regeneration. Thanks, Alex. So restoration is, as I'm sure most of you probably already know, is a long game, and you will get gains in the early stages for sure, and you will always be having some benefit, but the benefits really grow with time and commitment and patience, and as will the diversity. So you might see a few animals and plants recruiting in the early stages, but that diversity will really increase over time, as if you can continue to manage pressures such as weeds and pest animal activity, which might have browsing impacts. A lot of ground flora might reach reproductive and seed setting quite quickly within a year or two and become self-sustaining, but many of our trees and shrubs actually require several years or more before they're mature enough to start setting seed and becoming self-sufficient and self-sustaining. So we really need to at least see them through to that stage, so that they're setting and establishing new seed banks, so that they've got the strength to keep going on and self-persisting. So stick with it, because the rewards do grow over time. Thanks, Alex. So timeframes and how long does it take? Well, it really does depend on a number of factors. Depends on what target ecosystem you're trying to restore for a start. As you can see in the top right there, I've got a picture of salt marsh, and plant communities like salt marshes or wetlands, they're really one layer of herbaceous vegetation with much shorter life cycles, and you can restore systems like that much more quickly than a forested or rainforest community with multiple layers that will take, could potentially take some decades to reach their mature state. So it really depends on that ecosystem. It also depends on the starting point and the condition it was when you started. How, what disturbance pressures there are from weeds or pest animals browsing, and also what level of input you can have. But also different components of the ecosystem will establish at different timeframes also. So what really takes the longest time is reaching those mature canopy trees that develop hollows and mature rainforest canopies. That's really the longest time frame. But in the meantime, there will be lots of other benefits through introducing the understory species diversity. And yeah, so I'll run through a few examples to give you some ideas of some examples using different strategies. Thanks, Alex. Yeah, so I've got 3 examples. So just to give you a bit of an insight into some on-ground examples. This one is from an Illawarra subtropical rainforest site where we had, the starting point was a really dense canopy of large leaf privet and really nothing underneath it. As you can see, the ground is actually quite bare. And so it was a solid canopy of privet. So our approach was to poison the privet, kill off those trees, remove that canopy that was shading out any recruitment, but leave the trees standing, because leaving standing trees is, might look a bit messy, but they are really valuable perches for birds to come, birds that have been foraging on adjoining bushland, adjoining rainforest and feeding on all those beautiful rainforest seeds, are coming in and sitting on these trees and depositing, contributing seed to the seed bank. So it's best to leave them, and that's what's happened here. And by year 5, you can see that photo on the right. And if you go to the next slide, Alex, By year 5, it's still quite young and it's still very much in development, but by year 5, we had over 80% of the species diversity that was in the very good condition rainforest next door. So the species richness, species diversity came back quite quickly because of the seed bank and leaving those trees for birds to bring in extra seed. But what takes the longer time frame is allowing those trees to reach their really mature height. But you can see those stinging trees there. They grew in 5 years' time, and they're about 4 or 5 meters tall there. So that's quite a quick response. They've got a really great role in being pioneers to establishing that canopy. And yeah, so that's a really great outcome, and it really didn't need any planting. That's just from working with the natural processes and maintenance weeding along the way. Thanks, Alex. I'll go to the next example. So this one is an example of restoring a paddock where you have good native vegetation next adjoining. The grazing pressure has been removed, and there was no planting in this example. This is really just an example of what can happen with natural regeneration, allowing that succession. So the first stage in the middle photo there shows you the colonization by wattles, acacia, and this in this case is mostly Mabel's wattle, Acacia mabile, and a little bit of black wattle. And what happened was that this canopy of wattle completely shaded out the exotic kikuyu and paspalum pasture grasses and shifted the whole ground flora to native grasses, mostly microlina and weeping grass, and Entalacea and Iplismanus and a number of other ground forbs. Without any treatment, that just happened naturally from that, allowing that succession to occur. And what that has done is it's thinned out that lower level of ground covers, which is then allowed for the next stage of recruitment of more complexity with a whole range of mid-story shrubs and eucalypts and spotted gum and cycads and mint bushes, correas, a whole lot of rainforest plants, clayoxylon and muttonwood. So that's all happened with just a little bit of maintenance weeding, not even that much, but so that's a really great outcome, and that's still very young. As you can see, we don't have mature eucalypts yet. The eucalypts are only about 10 centimeters diameter, so it's still got a way to go, but it's well on its way and it's already looking after itself. So that's a great outcome. Thanks, Alex. So this is an example of working with browsing threats, especially in a threatened species habitat. A lot of us are working in landscapes now where we have pressure from deer, or even swamp wallabies can have substantial browsing pressure on restoring landscapes. So this is a community where we had really substantial weed cover from lantana and prickly pear, which was pretty awful place to start. But anyway, that was treated and managed, and we left a lot of the dead trees, as you can see, and litter on the ground. And we had a huge successful recruitment of ground covers and coming back naturally. So it didn't need planting. It just needed a little bit of that initial observing and monitoring to see what recovered before we rushed in with plants. And if you go to the next slide, Alex. We are really lucky to have a huge recruitment of the target threatened plant, which was Illawarra zaeria in this case. And as you can see, those little fine linear leaf plants there are all seedlings of Illawarra zaeria, and we literally had them in the hundreds. But the difficulty is when you have browsing pressure with any plants, not just threatened plants, but with any plants. If you have browsing pressure, they will often target those young, juicy seedlings. So protecting them through to reproductive maturity is really super important, and caging them, fencing them, tree guarding them is really important. And a plant like Zaeria and many of our shrubs will take several years before it's mature enough to set seeds. So protecting, you might not even need to protect every single plant either, but just protecting pockets of them enough so that they can start building a seed bank and producing a self-supporting system is really key. Thanks, Alex. So it's really hard to be prescriptive because every site is super unique and will have a different ecosystem that you're working with, a different combination of weeds, pressures from browsing or pest animals potentially, different disturbances from fire or drought or climatic influences. So really the best thing you can do is be aware of the strategies, use them to your advantage, recognize the natural regeneration potential, and really observe and record what's happening. And the best way you can do that is through setting up your own monitoring. You don't have to be a superstar botanist to do this. Everybody can do this with a camera. You can do photo monitoring, and the main thing is that you're consistent and comparing the same thing each year. So if you can set up a fixed point, such as star pickets, which is common with photo points, just revisit that star picket every year and photograph in a particular direction or in, north, east, south, and west, and do that every year, and you can capture a really good time lapse of your progress, which is a really rewarding way to see your recognize your efforts, but also keep a record of what's worked and help others who are also working in restoration in your area, because everyone's learning and we've all got lessons to learn and share around and help each other. So, making the most of learning what you observe is really helpful. Everyone's got something to learn. And always looking back to your reference ecosystem and keep comparing your progress with that natural reference ecosystem. Go back in it, walk around it, have a look how it compares. Is there anything missing? What are the gaps? And maybe you need to consider adapting your management or trying new techniques if it's not working. But just keeping an open mind and being patient is really the main goal. Thanks, Alex. Yeah, so that's it for me. But restoration is really just a super rewarding thing. I really just recommend everyone experiments and compares and shares what works in your landscape, because we're all learning in different landscapes, so everyone's got something to contribute. And so thanks for listening, and I'm going to hand you over to Beth, who's got amazing knowledge about how to bring in the fauna habitat into our landscapes. Thank you.
Thanks, Jedda. That was wonderful. That's looking good, Beth.
Hello, everybody. Lovely to be with you this afternoon and to be able to tell you some information about how we can do a great work for fauna in our in our local areas.
There we go.
Yep.
Yeah, that's good now. Yeah, thank you.
Excellent. So I wanted to follow on from all that fantastic information that Jedda's just shared about plant communities and talk specifically about some of the fauna that we might be likely to encounter. And how we can help to bring that into our restoration projects. And I guess I just first wanted to give you a little run through of all the fantastic species that you might encounter as you go along through your restoration journey. And certainly when we're building from paddock up, we start with the tiny guys like the planigales. Then we might see succession moving through into some of our lovely radders. That'll go on to when we start to get a bit of a canopy, we might start seeing some of our arboreal mammals like possums and gliders starting to come in, and of course the fantastic diggers that are down at the ground level. And but hopefully by the time we get to that end of that restoration process, we're really lucky to have some of our more rare species like potentially quolls and greater gliders if we're lucky enough to be around long enough to see our restoration age to that level. Reptiles are perhaps one of the groups of animals that we really underestimate in terms of the importance of their roles in restored patches. And we absolutely want to be able to see fairly on in our restoration process some of our lovely leaf litter snakes like this golden crown snake here, small skinks, legless lizards. We might be lucky enough to see geckos as time moves on, and hopefully things like the larger snakes will start to move into the patches. And if we've got water in there, we'd be seeing water dragons. And all of these things play fantastic roles in controlling insect species, but also are acting as food for some of the other trophic levels within our plantings. So they're really things that we want to encourage and to pay attention to when we see them in our planting, in our areas that we're restoring. Frogs are a great one to include, of course, because they are the species that might indicate when our plantings or our restoration patches are really healthy. We usually at the beginning we start to see things like striped marsh frogs, and then as we start to get a bit of vegetation diversity coming along, little tree frogs will come in because they tend to be smaller bodied, so they don't get chomped up as easily as other species. Then we start to see some of the bigger tree frogs coming through, and finally, if we're really lucky, we might start to see some of those big ground dwelling frogs when our restoration sites age, if we're in forested areas particularly. And of course, Jedda mentioned in her talk all of the opportunities that the bird fauna bring in to the landscape. And these are things that we really want to encourage in all of our restoration areas, from tiny guys that we might see fairly early on, like little sticklers, to things like barn owls, which often adapt to fairly modified environments if we can provide the right ingredients for them to get in your patches. Tawny frogmouths start using the areas fairly early on, and I would say that it's really important, just following on from Jed's point about those acacias and that early pioneer stage, to not underestimate how important those stages are for bird life. So this little nest that you can see up here in the right-hand top corner is actually in one of those patches of wattles. That patch was a monoculture of wattles after fire, only about 2 years old, and there were so many of these small bird nests all through that area of wattles, even so quickly after such a large fire had gone through the environment. So really those wattles play a huge role, not just in recruiting plant species, but also in supporting fauna, and then allowing the regeneration of all of your faunal communities to come through. And of course, when restoration gets far down the track, you're really excited to be able to see evidence of breeding of plant species. And this grass nest on the bottom left-hand side of the screen there is one that's been built by the finches in one of our plantings that's about 5 years old, which is super exciting to see. And I've put the frugivores, these big birds like pigeons and currawongs, specifically into this bird slide because these guys will accelerate the plantings. And one of the things that we see about regeneration, whether it's planted or natural regeneration occurring on patches of land that have been disturbed, is often plants that have really large fruits don't have a way to spread those fruits around if we don't encourage those big fruit-eating birds to get into the patches. So ways to bring those birds in will really help to accelerate the restoration of those patches. So I guess what I wanted to talk about is not only about planting, but about all of the rest of the ways we can actually build complexity into our restored landscapes that will help animals get in there and start using them. And of course, one of the first things that we need to do is to make sure that there's a way for animals to actually move from the areas where they're currently existing into our restored patches. We often think about the restoration of landscapes as building corridors that extend, often some hundreds of meters or further, or across quite large patches of ground. But I really think we need to think about where we can create micro corridors within our restored landscape that allows hopscotch movement of fauna that will grow over time as the plants start to grow, and that will allow animals to move through, and not just to move through your patch, but actually to start living in it as well, and to create all that fantastic biodiversity that we want to see. When we're talking about getting birds into a patch, we really need to think about how far they're going to be able to move without getting chomped by something else. And we call that a maximum safe flight distance. We know for small birds, 40 meters would be quite large. So when we're looking at retreat sites or where birds are moving from our remnant patches into our restored patch, think about what's there for the birds to be safe in once they get to the other end of their movement path, and try to create that through natural processes or through things that you install into your restoration patches to allow your little birds to get in there. If we're talking about things like small mammals, we would expect possums to only be able to move about 15 meters without cover. Ground mammals, sometimes only 2 or 3 meters. And if we're talking about the gliding possums, 8 meters to 30 meters would be a really big amount of area to move across without cover. And so knowing those sorts of distances that animals are going to need to move will give us the opportunity to target the way we restore to actually encourage the fauna to move through. I've put this picture of powerful owl into the talk because I really want you to be aware of the value of weed species in your restoration. So most of the powerful owls that I've been chasing around the Greater Sydney Basin for several years live in privet, only in privet, and not in other plant communities, because privet's what's there. It provides the canopy that owls love to use, and there are lots of weed species that can actually do a fantastic job of feeding the things that are in your restored patch and also provide habitat. So of course, we want to always aim for those native species and look at our reference communities to work out what those species are. But when we do have weeds in the patch, it's important that we don't get in there gung-ho and start clearing all of those weeds away, as a mass clearing, because often we're removing habitat that can be really important for our fauna. So when we take weeds out, we try to do it in a way that's in a mosaic, that leaves some weed behind and takes some away, and gradually you incrementally work on your weeds over time. And that allows your fauna to still utilize those weed patches whilst the native restored stuff is growing up behind that weedy removal. Water is a huge part of promoting or bringing animals in from remnant patches into restored patches, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. And really what we need to do is think about how wide we might want our planting to be. So anything that's narrower than about 15 metres might be quite okay as a movement corridor when we're thinking about something like possums. But if we actually want them to live in a restored patch of area, if it's not wide enough, it might be that you have one set of possums that live in there, and they might defend that linear planting from all other animals that want to move through. And so suddenly you've got this blockage and you don't have that lovely continuity. And of course, we need that continuity to allow our animals to have really robust and healthy genetic populations as well. And so we want our plantings to be as wide as we can make them. And also we want to really think about planning specific areas within that restoration targeted to rare species, because whilst a lot of the time we see animals moving into restored areas, often it's a really small subset of that great diversity of the local animal population that we would like to see there. And we want to make sure that we're encouraging all of those things that Jedda mentioned, lots of complexity at all of the layers of the forest that creates a whole heap of niches, which allows so many different types of animals to actually get in there and use that restored patch. So complexity is absolutely the key, but do think about what it is that those rare species are going to need to help encourage them to start using your spot. Large old trees are a really important part of the story for wildlife. They're irreplaceable because they take so long to grow and mature and provide all of their ecological services to a landscape. And we know that it isn't just about the landscape or the biodiversity, that those large old trees are incredibly healthy for us as human beings as well, for our underlying mental state, for our sense of happiness, and often for our well-being as humans. So we shouldn't consider ourselves aside from this process of restoration, because those large old trees are actually bringing a huge amount of benefit biologically, but a huge amount of benefit to us as human beings. Tree hollows are critical limiting factors for wildlife in Australia, and there are about a quarter of our species in Australia that have to use tree hollows at some stage of their life to progress through their life cycle. We don't know a lot about most of what goes on up in the tree hollows. It's a really new area of ecology, and it's something that we're working towards understanding better. But we do know that without those tree hollows, we're going to lose a whole heap of species out of the environment. So everything we can do to retain those that exist is important. And as Jedda said, working from your large old trees and your dead stag trees out and creating your restoration around those habitat features can be really fantastic in accelerating what you're trying to build. We know that we selectively remove trees from the environment, both through natural processes like fire, but also we do this for firewood collection, and because people have this perception that particularly dead stag trees are unsafe features in the landscape. So it's really important to think about where you retain those features to make sure that you're safe in what you're doing on your own patch, but also to really aim to retain as many of these features as we can to encourage all sorts of diverse wildlife to get in and use them. Live and dead trees function really differently in terms of the hollows that they offer to wildlife, particularly when we have a wet year. Dead trees tend to be much better because they don't tend to flood as much as live trees. So you need a mixture of living and dead trees, and you need to think about where the next generation of trees that can bear hollows will come from as well. Because often we'd think about retaining the big old tree with a hollow that we can see in it, but eventually that's going to die. And even after it dies, it still provides amenity to wildlife, probably for another 30 or 40 years if we're lucky. But we need to retain that generation of old trees that are going to grow through and make the next generation of tree hollows as well, if we want to really think about longevity in the patch that we're trying to build. And of course, the other thing is that tree hollows become really important sallying points, as Jedda mentioned, for wildlife, and often they create great perch areas, and those perch areas will regenerate or will accelerate regeneration. Jed talked about that, so we don't need to go on. The other thing that I'd just quickly mention about trees is that we're losing them really, really quickly, far quicker than they're being replaced, both in urban and rural spaces. And the estimates for the urban areas are that if we don't start to do something about retaining these trees, that we won't have any left within the next 100 years. We don't have the figures for the rural space there, but we know that with every 7 hectares of burning, we're losing probably 4 to 5 hollow-bearing trees that are really important for our large hollow nesters. So trees are really something that we need to focus on retaining. And of course, I just wanted to show you what it looks like when you can get a really great area of regeneration. This is a pigeon perch inside one of those monocultures of acacia that I talked about before. And there are 3 or 4 different species growing up out of the one space that pigeon like to stop and perch and to leave seed for us. So it's really important to think about the amenity that those perches offer. When we're thinking about tree hollows, how readily they form will depend on the species of tree and where you are. But we know that all trees take a long time. So small hollows will take about 80 years. Here's our little superb parrot in what we would call a small to potentially medium-sized hollow. When we're talking about something that the possums love to use, we might be getting up to 150 years, and the big old hollows that things like glossy black cockatoos need will take potentially up to 150 to 200 years to form. The other thing about trees, of course, is that they store a whole heap of carbon for us, so they're excellent to retain on site. That they provide refuges during fire, and particularly they can provide drinking areas, which is really great. They provide the most abundant nectar and seed when they're these large old trees, as opposed to the young trees that we might see in our restorations. And as I said, after death, they can remain habitat for a long time. And this tree that you're seeing on the image on the right-hand side is actually a powerful owl hollow. Even though the tree's burnt out and is holding on by a thread, the owls are still happily nesting in the top part of the tree up here. And the other thing about these trees is because they're so rare in landscapes, they tend to be used by a whole heap of different types of animals. Often as many as 2 or 3 species might be in the same hollow, using it at the same time. Tree hollows are incredibly sought after. So I just wanted to show you a quick picture of this little owl chick. It's being menaced by this cockatoo. So usually when a species vacates the hollow and gets out of it, once it's finished using it, the next species will actually be in that hollow within half a day, using that for its own breeding purposes. And I guess the key message for all of this stuff about tree hollows is that we need to really stop cutting them down and to retain them wherever they persist in our environment, to make sure that we do all of the good work that they allow, particularly in restored patches. So this is what I would really recommend for you in terms of the way you use your trees. Plan to use your timber resources to retain your old trees, of course. When you have hollows, if you have a tree that comes down and it bears hollows, you can reinstall that as a log hollow. Try to incorporate those large trees into your restoration designs, and manage resources in a way that makes sure that you don't have any damage to yourself as people, but also to your assets on your patch. And that might mean doing things like managing the canopy, removing some branches and keeping the bulk of the tree canopy above the main trunk of the tree so that you don't have branches falling off the side. it's really important to pay attention to who's using your trees, and if there's the opportunity to support research into who uses your trees, I think that's incredibly brings a whole heap of knowledge to this idea of understanding the value of trees. Just wanted to have a quick yammer about nest boxes because everyone loves to know whether nest boxes are a great thing. This is a glossy black cockatoo nest box, and my colleague Lauren, who's climbing up to manage that one. So the nest boxes come in several different varieties, and they seem to be ever expanding in the weird ways they're created by people nowadays. On the left-hand side here is a 3D printed hemp crate hollow, something that they're trialing for large hollow nesters in Melbourne at the moment. Not particularly successful for the target species so far. Log hollows seem to be very popular, and this might be something that you would do if you had a tree with a hollow come down in your place. You could cut a section of that off, create a base plate, create a top and an entrance hole, and pop that back up into another tree that was living. And of course, there are a whole heap of timber nest box designs that people love to use, and these aren't necessarily bad, but it's really important to think about how animals are going to get out of the inside of the box and inside the box from the outside. So perches on the outside are often a really good idea. And then there are a whole heap of cut-in hollows, which seem to be a new way that people like to do tree hollows. And I would say that we don't have a great deal of information about how useful many of these are, particularly for threatened species. But for some of the common species, they do seem to work quite well. So they come in varieties where you cut a big plate out and chuck a small bit of wood back in and create a narrow door hollow. And this entrance size of the hollow itself tends to be really important. Animals will try to get into hollows that have the smallest entrance hole size to stop predators following them into the hollows to eat up themselves and their babies. For those things that can't get into a very small entrance hole, we create cut-in hollows with a big base plate at the back of the tree. So these are the sorts of sizes for our parrots and our large owls. And of course, there are hollow hog hollows, which tend to have a small entrance hole, but then quite a large hollow using a special tool to drill out the cavity behind. Of course, some of the other ways that we can create complexity in our restored patches would be to use piles of logs and rocks. These are known by a whole different heap of names. We call them habitat piles or rock piles. Habistack seems to be one of the names people like to call them by at the moment. And I find that these things are really fantastic in terms of establishing stepping stones, particularly when you're doing things like paddock restoration, where you don't have a whole lot of complexity and you want to try to bring things through the landscape. They're very cheap to make because you can often use them, build them from resources that are there on site. And they're really fantastic, particularly when you build them using timber, because they promote nutrient cycling as that timber is degraded by the insect fauna that start to come and colonize these piles. They provide fantastic refuges for some of our other trophic levels, particularly reptiles and small mammals are great. And they're really good, of course, for allowing birds to fly into your patch and perch, deposit their seed, and help accelerate the restoration that way. I hear people talk about these piles, and I know there was a question about rock picking, and this is a bit of an example of rock picking on a paddock. So often people consider rocks to be problematic for using machinery on paddocks, or that they change the way paddocks drain, and so they gather all the rocks up and put them into a pile. And I'd say that these habitat piles aren't necessarily bad. They're probably just not as effective as something that contains both rock and timber, or is only timber. One of the things that I hear people say about these sorts of piles, however, is that that you will get a whole heap of snakes in your pile of rocks. And that's true. You probably will get some snakes in your pile of rocks because they're a lovely, fantastic heat source. They're a great way to actually provide habitat on paddock, because we need to think about paddock, particularly when it's just a paddock full of grasses, acting like the ocean for fauna. And so when you start to put a bit of complexity on there, that's like an island in the ocean that they can start to use. One of the myths about these rock piles, though, is that they're going to be full of snakes, but they tend to be full of snakes that aren't really going to do much to harm us. Things like eastern brown snakes tend to be less common where we have piles like this, because lots of other reptiles come along that like to eat baby snakes. And also people talk about these piles in terms of their danger as repositories for fire. But what we know about is that when we have fallen timber down on the ground, often when it's large diameter fallen timber, it actually holds fire. So if fires move through the landscape, it tends to slow fire down a lot, and that fire might lick through, you've all seen a stump burning for days and days after a fire with this slow, quiet burn. And often when you have timber piles in paddocks, instead of the fire then racing across the grass, it might just sit in those timber piles and actually slow everything down. So they can be quite good that way. One of the other things that I would love to encourage people to celebrate when they see on their patches of restored land is those things that dig. Our digging things we think of as ecosystem engineers, particularly things like bandicoots and wombats, are fantastic at what they do in terms of accelerating the rest of your plant growth because of the activity they do. So ecosystem engineers are those things that exist in the landscape but do more than just existing there. So this digging is fantastic. If you're a bandicoot, you might be digging up to 400 poke holes in an evening. That turns over about 13 kilos of soil and about 4.8 tons of soil over the course of a year. And that digging is fantastic because it can actually change fire conditions by burying litter under the ground, which increases nutrients in the soil, which is fantastic to build your soil up. And digging also stimulates seed banks because you get these little holes in the ground that particularly catch water and sometimes catch a bit of the leaf litter as well, and that allows microsites for germination to happen. And slowing the water down when it moves across the landscape by the water flowing into all of these digs is really great for reducing erosion. It disperses fungi, and we know there are lots of good associations between fungi and plants. And it makes a really diverse resource of food because often turning the soil over can bring a whole heap of different food that isn't available on the top of the soil to the top, particularly for birds. So often when we see wombats doing a fantastic amount of digging, you see different sorts of birds move into the landscape to exploit those resources that the wombats are throwing out. And wombat burrows particularly are important where we have hot places because they tend to create really cool refuges in the summertime, and often a whole heap of animals will get into the wombat burrows and start to use them. So they're definitely things that we want to encourage when we see our digging creatures. Benefiting wildlife means that we have to be careful about what we do as land managers to protect our patches. And of course, we want defence to remove stock if we have grazing on land, but we really need to be careful about the sorts of things we fence with. We would always try to avoid barbed wire, and at least on the top 2 strands, if not all of the fence, if you could do, because when animals run into barbed wire, things like this poor little kookaburra image on the right hand of the side happen. This is actually a bird. I watched this bird get entangled. It was fine. It survived. I'm covering its eyes there so it doesn't freak itself out and try to squiggle while I get it off the fence. But it's really important that we think about not using barbed wire where we see animals travel regularly through areas. So if they're moving from your remnant space to maybe to a dam that might be inside your restored patch, and they have to go through a barbed wire fence to do that, the likelihood is that someone's going to get hung up at some stage. Similarly, if there are movement paths that we see, particularly our gliding mammals and owls are really prone to entanglement, as are our fruit bats. So if there are regular areas of movement, we want to make sure that we're not using barbed wire in those areas. We don't want to use barbed wire near any fruiting or flowering trees. And of course, we don't want barbed wire exposed above the water level in wetland plantings. There are lots of solutions for wildlife-friendly fencing, and if you look in some of the documents that Jen will talk about, she'll be able to tell you about those. But you can use standoffs to push a strand of plain wire away from your barbed fence if you don't have the funds to, reinstall the whole few top lines of your fence. You can use tags to make your barbed wire more visible, and it's really important to think about how to space that wire to make sure that we're being really friendly to the sorts of animals that we want to have move through, particularly things like echidnas, like this little fella I've seen hung up on the bottom wire when it's too low. So follow that link at the bottom of the screen if you'd like to have a whole heap of great information about how to do wildlife-friendly fencing. Just a really quick talk about pest species. I think there's a few, of course, cats and foxes we all know are very detrimental to our wildlife, particularly to those sort of ground fauna that we're encouraging into our new restored plantings and to our bird fauna as well. You don't really need to go through all of this, but I guess the main point is that if we think about how many foxes and cats are hanging around currently in our landscape, somewhere around 1.7 million foxes and 2.1 million cats consecutively, they're really eating almost 6 million different types of native wildlife every single day. So it's really important that we think about controlling these species when we start to see them move into our restored areas. One of the ways to do this is to actually make sure that you're reporting those pest species when you see them. Using the Feral Scan app is a great way, which will help you work with your land managers to target best solutions for pest control. And I really wanted to have a quick word here about rats. So that's a black rat down on the left-hand corner of the image, and that one, it's important to think about rats because rats have got a huge impact on nestling birds, on eggs, and on our large fruited seeds as well. So if exotic rats are in your planting, you really want to start working towards trapping some of those and removing them. And it's worth just having a mention of our noisy miner, which of course is a native bird species, but has a huge impact on bullying and pushing out a whole heap of our small bird fauna. And new research from the Charles Sturt University has found that noisy miners are really heavily associated with native trees, but really negatively associated with shrub diversity. So it's really important to try to encourage really a good complex shrub layer to prevent the noisy miners from getting in and bullying the other birds, but also providing retreat sites for your little birds as they move through. And finally, I wanted to talk a bit about planting if that's one of the avenues that you decide to go down. Planting, of course, is fantastic, and we do need to use it sometimes in areas that don't have that really resilient seed bank that can get up and start throwing plants back into the world for us. Planting provides foraging and breeding, of course. We talked about it supporting movement. We need to make sure that it's really diverse with as many species and as many different layers of plants that we can put in there, so we get complexity at all levels. Once we do that, we'll start to create those retreat sites that allows fauna to start moving in. And we really want to think about how we plant in the landscape. Sometimes it's not about one tree every 2 meters or whatever it is, but think about cluster planting spiky species that will provide those retreat sites for our little birds to get in and start using our patches. And it's really important, of course, to encourage those large fruited species. So the birds that will eat those large fruits need to be encouraged to move into your plantings. And I just wanted to say that planting is often more than just the plants themselves. And the amenity of the equipment that we put in when we're actually regenerating a patch can have a huge benefit for wildlife. So here's a year-old planting with a little tree frog quite happily sheltering in a tree guard. And if you can see here and here, there are 2 black-faced cuckoo shrikes that are happily feeding down in this patch. I actually watched them feeding in this young planting for about almost 40 minutes, quite happily. And I would say that the grass that comes up between your plantings can have a huge benefit for fauna. And on heaps of the properties that I'm working on at the moment, little cisticlas have started to come back into the farmscape where they've never been before, primarily because there's these long grassy resources that are allowed to persist inside those planted areas. So really don't clean up. What you want to do is create that complexity wherever you can get it. Of course, we need to not forget about the insects. It's really important that we choose diverse mixes of local native plants to provide floral and pollen resources. If we're going to use chemicals in our restored areas, make sure you use things that don't have residue. And we really want to make sure that we plant species that have overlapping flowering times to make sure that resource of food for our insect fauna is constant all the way through the year if we can. And I guess one of the things particularly about native bees is that we know they're incredibly important as pollinators, but they tend to have very short tongues compared to our European bees. So think about planting some of those flowers with shorter flower morphology, and the Myrtaceae species are the ones that will provide really great fodder for our native bees. Water is important, as I said. It's one of the things that will allow species to stay in your patches. If you're trying to encourage your insect diversity, some things won't be able to go through their life cycle without water. So it's great to have some in there, whether it's natural things like Phyto taumata, whether you build ponds or whether you put in a wildlife drinking station. When you put water in there, make sure that there's escape points so things don't fall into the water and drown. It happens a lot more often than we would think it does. And I would say that it's really important that water sources get a bit of a hose out occasionally, because often there's disease processes that can be transferred through water. The other thing I'd say is that often water is a great place to collect seed, believe it or not, because you have currawongs that come along and want to make these pellets that they're vomiting out. Often they have a drink to help them vomit the pellets out, and they'll drop a lot of seed into the water itself and potentially just on the outside of the water source too. So water's awesome for encouraging those large frugies that we want to have in our plantings. We know that restoration takes time and effort, but it's really has magnificent rewards. As Jed said, it's really important that we keep records of what works for us, and it's really important that we keep telling everyone else how great we do so that we can make a better world. Thank you.
Thanks, Beth. That was great.
So, yeah, handing over to you, Jen. Thank you.
Okay. I think I've managed to share that okay.
Yep.
Great. Okay. Yeah, it was great listening. Hi, everyone. My name's Jen. I'm from the New South Wales Biodiversity Conservation Trust. Thanks for joining us over your lunch break. And it was really great to hear from Jedda and also Beth in terms of some tips and tricks for us in terms of our restoration. I've got lots of ideas and feeling quite inspired now, and you know, some great ideas there in terms of exploring before you restore, and the importance of connectivity and complexity in our restoration sites. I'm just going to take 5 minutes of your time just to talk through some options and support and resources that are available to us in to support us in conserving biodiversity on our land, and also some resources to support restoration. Just briefly, the Biodiversity Conservation Trust, for those that haven't encountered us, we're an arm of government, and we work to increase private land conservation in New South Wales. Our role is to support landholders to conserve biodiversity on their land. And another big part of our job is to promote public awareness of biodiversity. And that's why we're really pleased to be here today, partnering with Landcare and sharing tips and tricks around biodiversity and conservation with you all. Excuse me. At the BCT, there's lots of ways in which people can get involved in private land conservation in New South Wales. At the Biodiversity Conservation Trust, we support landholders who have, I suppose, some of those larger patches of biodiversity or native vegetation on their land. So if there's anyone, there will be landholders who are participating in our programs online. Other people that are listening in may have land that has, say, more than 10 hectares of biodiversity or native vegetation that you're interested in conserving or protecting. At the BCT, we offer different types of agreements to suit location, property size, and type and eligibility of funding. People can choose an area of their land that they'd like to place under a conservation agreement with us, and in return, you can receive financial support in exchange for managing biodiversity on your land. So just a shout out to anyone that may be interested to come and have a chat to us, and we can talk through which agreement types may suit you and your needs. There'll also be people listening in today who have smaller patches of native vegetation biodiversity on their land and wonder how they may get some additional support. There's programs in New South Wales like the Wildlife Land Trust program and Land for Wildlife programs that are available to landholders in similar ways. So you can access support and also access financial support to help you manage biodiversity on your land. So they offer grant programs and extension support as well. So if you've got a smaller patch of land, say less than 10 hectares, and you're interested in an agreement, have a think about Wildlife Land Trust and also Land for Wildlife. The other options are always speaking to your local council. Local land services have some great ideas and support programs for smaller patches, and as well as obviously getting involved in your local land care group if you're not already.
If you do have a conservation agreement, either with the BCT or those other programs, it does enable you to access grant funding to support you to do restoration work. Some of those the grant programs that are on offer can fund things like assisted regeneration, weed control, fencing, pest control, regeneration, so supplementary planting if you wanted to, and also just general habitat restoration. So sometimes people will, so financial support is a barrier to you in terms of doing some restoration on your property. Have a think about accessing a type of agreement that might suit you, and then that will enable you to access grant funding to support you to do restoration activities. Today we've spoken about some of these apps and information sources that can help you learn about biodiversity around you. So Jedda spoke of the Trees Near Me app, which is something you can download on your phone. It can show you what type of native vegetation occurs around you. There's a Soils Near Me app. There's BioNet, which is can tell you what plants and animals are in your local area. There's also other types of government services, Saving Our Species program, threatened species and the like. But other citizen science apps, which a lot of people are using these days, Nature Mapper and iNaturalist, can give you really, really good insights into local plants and animals in your local patch. We spoke about, Beth spoke about conservation fencing, so wildlife friendly fencing. The BCT has guidelines to support landholders to do fencing activities in a way that is wildlife friendly. We also have guidelines to support landholders to do restoration. There's also some other links that I've put on the slide here, and we'll send this out to you after today's webinar. Just some other ideas in terms of if you needed to get access to bush regenerators on your property, if you're wanting to source local plants, if you're wanting to think about seed collection on your property, and if you wanted some general resources in terms of bush regeneration and restoration, there's some links and tips on this slide. One other thing I'd just like to plug is that the Biodiversity Conservation Trust has a free at your own pace online option for people to study conservation and land management. It's accessible to anyone in New South Wales, I think. And so you can go along and learn and study modules like pest control, weed control, revegetation, restoration, those kind of things. So take a look at that if you're interested, and the link will come around. We also have some interesting guidelines, school resources on our website that can support people to learn more broadly around biodiversity and conservation. And if after this you feel inspired or you've still got questions, obviously pop them in the chat for us and we can answer them for you now if we can. The other thing is that you can contact us at any time. We've got regional staff across the southeast who are here to provide you with different types of support if you need it. You can, and there's some contact details there for us